My name is Greg Taylor. I'm on the infrastructure team. I manage one of the teams within the infrastructure department at Reddit. And today I'll be telling you a story of how we scaled our technology and our process and our culture as the company has grown significantly over the last 3 years. But first, what is Reddit? Depending on who you ask, you get a lot of different answers here, ranging from the front page of the internet in a nod to our beginnings as a content aggregator to where the cat memes lives. And we're also a place for lively discourse that is always civil and serious. So, but I'm being serious here. But today we tend to define Reddit as it's a social network whose focus lies on user-created and operated communities rather than individuals. And these subreddits cover topics such as news, politics, sports, gaming, technology, music, entertainment, and all sorts of other things I'll leave it at that. But to make this more concrete, let's run through some of my current favorites. First up is crappy design. And as you can probably see, well, first of all, this is self-described as where the Comic Sans and lens flare flow unfiltered. I think that's very eloquently put by the moderators. As you attempt to read the slide, you'll probably get an idea of what this is all about. Will you marry me? Or something like that. But cup holders that don't hold cups, interesting error messages, cringeworthy images, these are all the province of crappy design. Next up, the Ocho, and this holds a very special place in my heart. It's dedicated. The Ocho is dedicated to spreading knowledge of seldom seen and obscure sports. So, yeah, you are seeing the crowd-pleasing trampoline Roman candle battle. And while not all sports covered by the Ocho is quite as explosive as this one, they are every bit as unusual. So highly recommend if you haven't checked it out. And as a side note, please make good decisions, friends. Which takes us to, it's not all about fun and cat memes and jokes on Reddit, though. For many, Reddit is the place to discuss current events and happenings around the world. And in most cases, you'll be able to find a thread within moments of something happening, which is pretty cool. We've also got a live feature where you can get kind of by-the-moment coverage of certain events. So on this slide, we're showcasing news, but there are many more news-oriented communities there. For example, world news, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. You can use subreddits like these to keep in touch with what's going on in your city, your state, your country, or even the wider world. So check it out, and we're working on an exciting new news feature that'll help surface some of that, so also check that out here in the next few months. Next up is Dad It. And as my shameless dad jokes probably give away, I'm a dad, and a relatively new one at that. And if I'm being honest, I have no idea what I'm doing. And unfortunately, these little guys and girls don't come with instruction manuals, so for me, the next best thing is Dad It. And you'll find other dads in here asking questions, sharing tips, telling stories, celebrating milestones, and comforting one another during the harder times. And everybody gets something different from a community like this. But I will say that Dad It has comforted, informed, and assisted me in my ongoing pursuit in getting one of those world's best dad mugs. So there is that. Before we move on, I'll also take a moment to plug some other related communities such as Momit, Beyond the Bump, and Parroting. And finally, this is one that you're most likely to probably heard of, IAMA. Reddit's also a great place for Q&A style discussions like this. In our IAMA, noteworthy folks stop by to conduct AMAs or Ask Me Anything sessions. And these participants range from politicians, athletes, entertainers, musicians, successful business people, philanthropists, and even the second person to step on the moon. So that's pretty cool. It's hard to, in thinking about it, I don't know where else you have is direct access to interesting and noteworthy people like this on the internet. It really is amazing. Just sitting presidents and Bill freaking Gates 6 times, and it's all on Reddit. So now that we've covered some of what these subreddits are and just a few examples that are dear to me, let's get a sense of the scale that Reddit operates at. There's pretty good consensus that. Well, it depends on who you ask, but most answer that we are in the top 10 most trafficked websites in the world. Our monthly active users clock in at 330 million. And to help put that into perspective, the population of the U.S. is 320 million. So it's a good number, just a few. And we've got 138,000 active communities. And those communities produce over 12 million posts per month. And those 12 million posts generate over 2 billion votes a month. Now, let's do a quick thought exercise here. Given these numbers, I want you to go ahead and try to estimate what the size of the engineering organization is that supports something like this. I'll just give you just a second. And I'm sure some of you are smirking, so I think in some ways the secret is probably out. So, just to give you an idea of where we were and where we are, we started early 2016 with 25 engineers. So if you and our traffic level, it's grown since then, but it's still in about the same general ballpark. So if you think about engineer per MAU or monthly active user, it's significant. Now the other interesting thing is that today we have 185 engineers, so that's over a 7x increase. And I almost said we only have 185 engineers because that's it's still we're still a smaller organization, but the growth has been rapid. And you don't do a 7x increase without having some growing pains. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is how we have scaled from tiny engineering organization to slightly less tiny engineering organization, and some of the challenges that accompany that sort of thing. So let's get in your time machine of choice, strap in, and go back to 2016. And here we are. This is Reddit in 2016, particularly the engineering side. You see we have our lovable monolith in the middle here, and we have a few snooze around there. Those are the engineers happily at work. It was a much simpler time, but also a lot fewer of us. So a lot of this talk will be from the perspective of the infrastructure team, because this is the perspective I saw it from. And the infrastructure team was one of the few teams to arrive from the primordial soup, and there were about 5 of us in early 2016 supporting the other 20 engineers. And at the time, we handled a mixture of operations and back-end development on the monolith. And since our infrastructure was relatively static, this was reasonable. We didn't need to stand up new services very often. We handled all the provisioning and configuration of systems when we did have to stand new things up. And we also handled most non-trivial debugging in production because we had the most access, and we could reach the most dusty and forgotten corners of our monolith and our stack. And like I said, this arrangement worked well for over a decade. And just to get an idea of what some of the stack looks like here, I won't spend too much time on this, but there's not a whole lot of surprising things in here, nothing that really makes your eyes pop out, and by and large, that was seen as a feature, and this stack got us to a lot of the numbers that you're seeing today. But about midway through 2016, we started growing rapidly. As the ambitions of the company expanded, so too did the engineering organization. And pictured over here, you'll see the one of our onboarding, our new employee onboarding sessions. Or maybe not really, but that's what it kind of felt like. So as we added people, our ranks swelled, and we began having difficulties scaling our development around this monolith. And while there are plenty of examples of teams who have successfully built and scaled the organization around a monolith, our particular monolith was pretty old, over 10 years, and full of razor blades and all sorts of things of questionable origin. It was difficult to make changes without breaking things. So it was sort of like the development equivalent of the butterfly effect, but with a little bit more explosions. So every deploy was an adventure. And as a result, our productivity wasn't scaling as well as we had liked as the organization grew. So we had a spirited discussion, and we met to determine a path forward, and our goal was to figure out how we could help all these new engineering teams that were appearing develop and operate efficiently alongside one another. We considered a number of options ranging from a complete rewrite to a rehabilitation, but we also had a few other things to keep in mind. We had an aggressive roadmap to consider, and regardless of which path we took, we had to be making progress on it. After much gnashing of teeth and discussion, we decided to pursue a service-oriented architecture, and that involved picking apart the monolith. And previously, as a smaller organization, we didn't like the complexity trade-off with this. But as we were quickly growing and finding ourselves having a hard time dealing with what we had, this looked pretty attractive, and it was worth the trade-offs for us. And the primary consideration for us was this was going to give us a better separation of concerns between teams, and we felt that we were ready. We felt that we were ready to deal with the increased complexity. But I will say this: if you do have a monolith and it's working well for you, go home, give it a hug, tell you love it, worse than all. So we'll say that. So with the decision made, our first service came to be in early to mid 2016. And here it was. We brought it online. Trumpets sounded. Fireworks took flight. A choir of angels sang. It was magnificent. Except it uncovered some issues that we had been sitting on for a while. We quickly became evident that this thing that we've been putting off for a long time, incorporating more of a culture of automated testing, was going to be really important as we stamped these additional services out. So there was 3 or 4 different attempts to introduce like CI and automated testing as a deep part of our organizational DNA over our history, but it just never quite took root. So we researched a bunch of options and decided to build on something called Drone CI, which we found to be a little bit more humane and easy to use than our prior attempts. And over time, automated testing became more of an expectation rather than a nicety. And today we endeavor to never break the master branch. And when that does happen, it's an incident. The other thing that became really quickly evident is that instead of copy pasting services out from one another, we needed to have a service framework to base off of. And we were very creative in our naming, calling it Baseplate. You get it? Baseplate. And by building our services on Baseplate, we get a measure of consistency between services. They're configured the same way. They expose a similar set of ports. They have the same async event loop. They handle RPC clients and servers the same, and they fetch secrets the same. And we'll revisit why this is important later on, but know that this is very important. We also baked a bunch of our patterns and best practices into Baseplate, so each service owner doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. So, for example, things that you get out of the box include logging, instrumentation, tracing, secrets fetching, and a bunch of other things. So these are things that our engineers don't have to do a whole lot of thinking about. And the other interesting bit is we're developing this in open on GitHub, and while it is a very opinionated building block, it's there. It's there and available to you, and maybe it'll inspire you or help you in some way. So check it out. So hey, we got our first service up. That's pretty cool. Back to mid 2016 now, and fresh off of our success, it was time to stand up a second service. And this time we didn't bother with the fireworks or the choir of angels. We did this. We're experts at this point. Our second service. But the realization quickly set in that our then artisanal, handcrafted infrastructure was starting to be a liability. And by artisanal, I mean going into the Amazon console, clicking around, and anybody guilty of this at one point or another? Anybody? Oh man, I'm seeing like 2 hands. Oh, I call BS. All right. So this seems so obvious to us now, but also keep in mind that Reddit kind of predates CloudFormation and Terraform and Google Deployment Manager and all sorts of other things. So that's not an excuse. That's not a good excuse, but yeah. So we resolved to move more towards infrastructure as code, and that means declaratively stating what we want in our infrastructure and having a tool apply it for us. It also meant that we could use our normal code review flows, which is very valuable to us, particularly for things like IAM policies. You want to get another set of eyes on those, or you'll let your intern spin down your business. And also really valuable to us was the idea of having reusable modules that we could use to stamp out similar infrastructure. And after evaluating a bunch of different options, or well, I guess 3 options, we ended up going with Terraform. And I'll be candid with you, this was really difficult. It was, and still to some extent, difficult to pull existing infrastructure into Terraform. But we just had to get started and we just got started and started chipping away. And well, is anybody fighting with this sort of thing right now, pulling existing infrastructure into Terraform? Okay, I see a few hands, so you know the struggle. And to add to that, back when we were doing this, it was hard to find best practices for this sort of thing. How do you manage your HCL files, and what are the boundaries of a module, and what are the boundaries of an environment? And our discussions with other users made it evident that everybody was kind of trying to figure this thing out on their own. So we made all sorts of mistakes. We created some tech debt. We cleaned it up. We battled with HCL a bunch. But today, this is a really important part of our stack, and it's helped us keep up with the pace of things. So once more, with feeling this time. This brings us to late 2016. We've got a decent test story. We've got a service framework. we're starting to manage infrastructure as code. And it was time to start pumping these services out. This was great. We pumped out our third and fourth services, but we hit another kind of milestone here in that we didn't have a great way to test our services against one another. So in a service-oriented architecture, this is not a good thing. And our monolith had a staging system that was very kind of opinionated and inflexible, and it had worked for us for a long time, but now that we had a bunch of other services, it wasn't appropriate to stamp out. And at the time, this Kubernetes thing was really starting to take off, and we were curious. We also had a few people with existing exposure. Also relevant and not listed here, we were starting to struggle a little bit with our background task and consumers as well, so that was another bit of relevant overlap. So this is a bit of a leap, but we decided to take 3 weeks and prototype what we could in a new Kubernetes-based staging system. And just to provide some color here, by this point in late 2016, Helm was still very young, and many or most of us were managing our clusters with static manifests and maybe a little bit of bash and sed. Anybody here guilty of that? Oh, okay, all right, just a few. Oh, tough crowd. which is exactly what we did. We wrote a CLI that wrapped kube control, which is the proper pronunciation of kube control, by the way. And we used that to deploy Docker images built by our CI image. And by the third week of our efforts, this was in the hands of our developers, and the reception, despite our best efforts, was very positive. So this was a huge success for us. While our staging system looks a lot bit different than that today, it's been an integral part in our journey to a service-oriented architecture. So gotta have one of these. And this brings us to early 2017. We have a growing tapestry of services. We have over 60 engineers at this point. We have quite a few different teams writing codes. Patterns are beginning to form in Terraform land. Baseplate is looking pretty good. And we're settling into this brave new service-oriented world. But we on the infrastructure team had now reached a threshold of our own. We had become a bottleneck. As I mentioned earlier, the infrastructure team has historically been the arbiter of production. So when new services need to be stood up, we provisioned the infrastructure, we did the configuration, and when there was an incident in production, we were usually the first responder. And this led to frustration all around. The infrastructure team was discouraged by the backlog and the increasing volume of incidents, and the other teams were rightly very frustrated with us holding up their roadmap. So seeking some short-term relief, we trained a few of the more infrastructure-oriented teams to use some of our systems and operations tools. So this is stuff like, these teams were able to build things using Terraform and Puppet, which is our two primary building blocks, and it also helped them move a little bit faster. But this doesn't come close to solving the full part of the problem in that not everybody's willing or able to do this. And it brings us to our next point. Not all teams want to operate the full stack for their service. I can't beat this point home hard enough. There comes a point in your organization's growth that this is not sustainable. And there's an entire spectrum of comfort here. When faced with the prospect of doing some infrastructure work, there are some teams that'll chortle with glee and tell you about the time they did a stage 1 Gen 2 install on their refrigerator. And there's others that will get up, scream in your face, and run away, never to be seen again. And we have to accommodate all of those. So, this is probably not a hot take, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect all of your engineers to have, or even most of your engineers, to have a deep understanding of your stack. And I think we're at our best when we help each engineering team, focus on the problems that they've been tasked to solve, instead of doing that plus wading into the murky waters of infrastructure. And to be honest, if you look at the stack here, it's pretty ho-hum. There's nothing too flashy here. But as an infrastructure engineer, we're spending 40 plus hours a week on all this stuff. But let's say if you're on like the native mobile team or something else, you have to fulfill your primary responsibilities plus deal with all this. So it comes down to what are we actually trying to do here? Let's step back and look at this from a higher level perspective. Our engineers are frustrated about having to wait on us. They feel like they aren't in control over their services lifecycle, and they're unable to debug some issues in production without our help. And if we had to distill all of this down into kind of a cohesive ask, we're really asking for service ownership. And we've established that not every team wants to manage its own infrastructure, but most teams do want to own the full lifecycle for their service. They want to be empowered to jump into development quickly, then graduate to a production-like environment where the finishing touches can be applied, And after that, they want to take their service to production without much dependence on the other teams. And once in production, they want to be able to instrument, monitor, and iterate on their service, again, without blockage. And these are all very reasonable expectations, and it's mutually beneficial for us all to figure out how more responsibility can lie with the service owner. But there are a few challenges to overcome. No matter how smoothly paved or neatly groomed the path we present for our service owners, the days of throwing code over the wall are over. They may not need to get a deep understanding of the infrastructure, but they will need to learn some basics and about whatever contact surface we present to them. More on that in a bit here. And with great power comes great responsibility, and depending on the team, the response to this newfound notion of service ownership will range from "this is awesome" to "can you just do it for me?" In our case, we're there to help, but we do expect the service owner to make an attempt to work towards self-sufficiency. And 9 times out of 10, service owner will see the value in being able to accomplish more faster, but I'll just give you a second here. The suspense. Boop! There will be explosions. Probably 3, at least 3, maybe even 5. That's a lot of explosions, though. But instead of getting caught up about what could happen, we can look at these happy little accidents as the learning opportunities that they are. And since the service owner is the first to get paged, they are highly motivated to get things sorted. So, going back to early 2018, how do we make all this happen? We've spent some time with the other engineering teams trying to get a feel for what they want. We've worked with them to define a notion of service ownership. And we've also established that it's not reasonable for most teams to understand the infrastructure at any deep level, in addition to the primary responsibilities. So how can we limit the learning curve while empowering our teams? This is where the notion of a Reddit infrastructure as a product comes into play. As you can see here from our little snoo, we had to change our thinking a little bit. Instead of expecting our team to come in and learn the moonlight as operators and sysadmins, we need to put together a cohesive infrastructure product. And the end result of this is a Reddit engineer should be able to take this thing off the shelf, read and follow the instructions, and have their service running without blockage or significant fuss. So we had to figure out what the right foundation for this thing looked like. And we started looking at ways to repackage and more humanely offer our tools. And there are companies out there that even with similar stacks that have pulled off just this very feat. But ultimately, we felt like there was a better way than pursuing that path. So perhaps we could continue using most of what we already had in infrastructure land, but maybe present a smaller API to our users. And you recall that I had mentioned Kubernetes as something we were playing with back in 2016. It's going to be relevant here. We had, at this point, over a year of success mucking around with Kubernetes for staging and a few other purposes. And it served us well. And though we didn't have a well-defined idea of how this would fit into the future of Reddit, it was something that we were very interested in. But to move in the direction of Kubernetes was a little bit scary for us in that it's a huge paradigm shift. It's a lot different than what we were doing. So despite this being spooky, we evaluated all the other options, and we felt like this was the best option for us. And as we sketched and experimented, we came to believe that this was the right answer for us. And while Kubernetes is a very complex piece of software, it provides a foundation for you to build on. And this is just the base plate of our offering. So we steeled our nerves and started on the journey to empowering service ownership for all. So how do we actually build it? It's not enough just to toss Kubernetes over the wall at your engineers. And I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I'm sure there are a few who know how futile this is. But our goal of offering a cohesive infrastructure product meant that we needed to build for ease of use, consistency, and the right level of flexibility with some measure of safety built in. In thinking through our problems and our ideal future, we arrived at a set of core tenets that I'll go over with you now. So the first up, limit the surface area. Here's our stack again. And getting back to this notion of a packaged infra product, we have to go from expecting our users to build something from these 100 pieces to instead saying, here's 1 or 2 things that you can use to build and operate your service. And by limiting the distinct set of technologies that the user needs to touch, we lessen context switching and lower the learning curve. So instead of requiring all knowledge of everything that you see here, we narrowed it down a bit. We decided to focus our users on Kubernetes and mostly hide the rest. And when I say Kubernetes, I mean the barest of essentials, a pod, a service, and a few other things. And we're able to pave over most of the rest of this without becoming a platform as a service type or traditional PaaS. And we support this with plenty of toolings, documentation, training, and on-demand advice. But by not having to learn the entire stack that we were making available, users are able to focus more on the service. This is only so useful unless we make the expectations as far as the relationship between the two parties more explicit. So we defined a sort of a contract, and that's a strong word, but bear with me for a minute here. We defined the product user as our service owners, so the other engineering teams, and the product operator as the infrastructure team. And product users are expected to learn the barest of essentials about Kubernetes, and they're expected to develop, deploy, and operate their own services. By extension, when there are incidents with their services in production, they'll get paid for those. Product operators is us, the infrastructure team, and we're responsible for provisioning, maintaining, and scaling the underlying infrastructure. If there are incidents with Kubernetes clusters or supporting infrastructure, we get paid. Also, if a service requires an S3 bucket or a cache or a database, the product operators are also responsible for that. After all, when you're working at our scale, you can't just apt-get install Postgres and be off on your merry way. So it takes a lot of expertise, and we're equipped to handle that. So in determining a dividing line for responsibilities, we allow each party to focus on the thing that they are best equipped to solve. Now, the next tenet. For our user-operator contract to actually work, we have to provide as much as we can out of the box. For example, by providing a starter, test, build, and deploy pipeline, we avoid the need for our teams to become release engineers. By baking in a set of default metrics and alerts and dashboards, we provide an immediately observable foundation for them to build on. And the same holds true for logging. This isn't something that our users should have to wire up themselves. And if a service interacts with another service, the service owner shouldn't have to learn the intricacies of our service mesh. If secrets or credentials are involved, a user should be able to quickly and easily set and retrieve those in production. And we're able to include all of these things out of the box due to the consistency that Baseplate gives us between services. And we can also, and by extension, we can make a lot of assumptions and simplify our tooling. So back to the main takeaway from all of this. Your users should get these things by virtue of using your product. If they have to rig up all these things by themselves, you do not have an infrastructure product. You have a pile of technology. So that brings us to our next point here. Paint by numbers. As we discussed earlier, teams differ in their willingness and ability to handle infrastructure work. Some are all about it, others not so much. Though we have to be able to support both sides of the spectrum. So instead of expecting users to take their lumps by slogging through upstream documentation and going through forums and blog posts, we provide a library of sort of paint by numbers guides to cover common tasks and problems. For example, here's how to set and retrieve secrets. Here's how to have your application assume a specific IAM role. Here's how to deploy an experimental release that handles a fraction of production traffic. We supplement these guides with training and extensive documentation. If you do not have extensive documentation, training, and support for your users, you do not have an infrastructure product. You have, again, a pile of technology. Also, we seek to auto-generate or template everything that we can, because as you've probably heard from some earlier sessions, asking people to write YAML manifests or Helm charts is borderline inhumane. That's very much the province of us, or ideally not even us. So in summary, let's read this last sentence together here, all right? Are you ready? An engineer should not require deep infra experience in order to be productive. Very good. I see you trying back here. I know it's hard to see, but I appreciate the effort. So, more consistency. Supporting the previous tenets, we have to provide consistency throughout the entire development cycle. So this means Kubernetes in local development, staging, production, our lab environment, and through the whole thing. And as far as how this works, we reuse the same Helm charts and Docker images throughout all three phases. And if you'd like to learn more about how that works at Reddit, we presented in 2018 Helm Summit. You can see me stumble through that awkwardly, just like I am now. So check that out. And the TLDR is that by pairing Helm charts with very phase-specific values, we can account for the few differences between each of these environments. The result of this is our developers don't need to learn to use 3 different systems. They build familiarity with our offering even in local development. And when it's time to go to production, they have a decent understanding of the basics already. And finally, we prevent many cases where something that works locally doesn't work in production. It's a very consistent environment. And everything that we have discussed thus far must be offered with tools and processes that help our users develop and deploy with confidence. Otherwise, we're just throwing crap over the wall and hoping not to make a mess. For example, we have an org-wide code review policy. We require at least one person review all commits and designs. And it can be frustrating to have to make time for this and to feel like you're being blocked, but it's a chance to collaboratively improve the quality of the thing that you're working on, and you'll also learn a few things. In addition to code review, we need a robust unit and integration test story. We need to be able to, and to break that down, we need to be able to test smaller isolated chunks of code, and we also should be able to test larger systems or services against one another. And to tie all of this together, by the time our changes are in line to go to production, they will have been ran through liners, automated tests, automated unit tests, integration tests. They will have been reviewed by at least one other person, and they will have been deployed to our staging environment. These tools and processes give us confidence that our deploy will be met with success. Well, some degree of confidence. Notice the disclaimer up at the title, some. So we're not arrogant that we make mistakes, as you saw with the guy in the truck, and yeah, that happened. So that brings us to our next point. With all that said, things are going to happen. And when the worst does inevitably happen, it's important to have guardrails and safeties that will limit the damage. For example, resource limits. They can prevent resource starvation with other services on the same cluster or the node. On the network side, a service mesh or some other mechanisms can be used to set service-to-service rate limits. And this one is particularly important for us being new to an SOA. Even today, I think just today we had services. We had a service clobbering another, and it led to disruptions. And we'll want to be able to tightly scope IAM and RBAC permissions to avoid compromise or unexpected fires. And by virtue of running all this on Kubernetes, we end up with a platform that makes it easy to do all of this. And it gives us a convenient way to scan for common mistakes. For example, if somebody gets through CI checks and they've defined a service type of load balancer and they've exposed something super secret to the world, maybe we page our security team. Ideally, we don't get to that point, but again, defense in depth here. And going a step further, Docker image policies can whitelist or blacklist what we allow to run on our clusters. And having these guardrails in place is a critical part of being able to trust the integrity of our offering. So I won't read through these again, but we've covered a lot of ground, and I wanted to kind of sum this up from a higher level perspective here. What does all this buy? And it sounds cool. There's a lot of things that I've shown you here, but what did it actually do? Our infrastructure product has helped us, wait for it, transform. I told you dad jokes. I have an excuse. So let's just talk through this a little bit. I will read this out and make a few points. Before, the infrastructure team provisioned and configured all infrastructure. Now, service owners use our kind of off-the-shelf infra product. Before, infra deployed, productionized new services. Now, service owners deploy and productionize new services. Before, infrastructure operated most services. That meant our pagers were getting blown up at odd hours. Now, service owners get that distinct honor. Before, infrastructure we kind of served as this necessary blocking dependency on production work. Now, infra is more of a support and advisory type team, and our primary goal is more of a role of enablement rather than we're going to do all this work. We've developed a means to distribute the responsibility. So while Reddit has seen some rapid growth over the last few years, it's probably not over. We're likely to see more of this. Well, again, maybe not like this, but it'll feel like this. And by building a cohesive infrastructure product, we've packaged and distributed the infrastructure team's expertise for other engineering teams to take advantage of. And in doing so, we've scaled ourselves, and we'll be able to hold up when we see this happen again. So I presented quite a bit of high-level stuff here, If you want to get more specific, come talk to me. I'll hang around in here until they kick us out, and if there's still people, I'll hang out in the hall. But please feel free to step by and ask questions. You can also get in touch with me as I'm GC Taylor on Reddit and Twitter. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we were hiring, like everybody else. And I'll just leave this up here, and I'll also take a moment to plug the Kubernetes subreddit. I think we are approaching 10,000 subscribers. So it's a smaller community, but it's reached that critical mass, and it's proving useful for even us. And also, the Reddit blog has some interesting technical posts for you. If you remember our Pixel social experiment for April Fools 2 years ago, it was a really nice overview of that. I think there may be something from this year as well, but we'll hopefully do even more on this in the future. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you.